The cell was cold and claustrophobic, but James didn't seem to care. He sat calmly in the center, arms crossed and eyes locked on the camera in the upper corner of the room. On the other side of the screen, Captain Rax watched the human with a mix of disdain and curiosity. Why was he alone on a dead planet? He asked Valak, the chief engineer. He has no weapons, no communication, nothing. He's just an old human. Rax frowned. Nothing about a human is just, he replied, without fully understanding why. The Zelon, one of the largest warships of the Vector fleet, was accustomed to inspiring fear. Its crew was disciplined and proud, and its weapons could obliterate entire fleets. But ever since James had been brought aboard, something felt off. Lights flickered for no reason, doors shut on their own, and the navigation systems experienced intermittent failures. Valak insisted these were technical glitches, but the growing frequency of the events began raising suspicions. "None of this happened before we brought him aboard," one officer muttered. Captain Rax entered the cell, determined to get answers. James slowly lifted his gaze, a faint smirk forming on his lips. "You've been watching me ever since you brought me here, Captain," he said calmly. "Have you found what you were looking for?" Rax ignored the provocative tone and stepped closer. "You're not like the other humans," he said. "Who are you?" James tilted his head as if pondering the question before replying. "Someone you shouldn't have underestimated." Meanwhile, Valak monitored the ship systems, trying to make sense of the anomalies. She discovered a strange pattern in the access logs, commands seemingly originating from within the ship, but unauthorized by anyone on the crew. "This doesn't make sense," she told one of the engineers. "It's as if someone is testing us." The idea that James, the seemingly harmless human, could be involved seemed absurd. But as the problems escalated, suspicion began to grow. James knew that time was on his side. He didn't need to rush. The ship was unraveling from within, and the Vectors didn't even realize they were playing directly into his hands. He stood and walked slowly to the cell door, staring into the camera with a cold, calculating gaze. "You think you're in control," he murmured, knowing no one could hear him. "But you're about to learn that control is an illusion." The cell where James was held had become a growing point of tension for the crew. Guards frequently passed through the corridor, casting curious and distrustful glances at the human. They whispered among themselves, increasingly convinced he had some role in the ship's unexplained malfunctions. "He's not doing anything. He hasn't even spoken to anyone," one guard remarked. "Then why does it feel like he's in control?" Another shot back, nervously adjusting his weapon. James, seated with a relaxed posture, seemed to hear every word, yet he remained unresponsive. Meanwhile, Valak was in the main control room, reviewing the systems. The glitches that had seemed like minor inconveniences before were now becoming serious. Auxiliary engines were shutting down randomly, security cameras displayed distorted images, and a sharp hum reverberated through the corridors. "The systems weren't designed for this," she said, frustrated. "It's like they're being rerouted, but I can't locate the source." One of the engineers suggested it was an external attack, but Valak shook her head. "There's no sign of external interference. All of this is coming from within the ship." In his cell, James slowly stood and walked to the small window in the steel door. He gazed at the empty corridor, his expression neutral, almost disinterested. However, his mind was in full motion. Every anomaly on the ship was carefully calculated, triggered by autonomous war drones he had programmed years ago. These drones were linked to the Zelon systems, responding solely to him. "They think they're in control," he thought, a faint smile playing on his lips. "But I've lost count of how many times I've seen this before." Captain Rax was losing his patience. He called a meeting with his top officers to discuss the situation. "This is no coincidence," he declared, slamming the table. "Ever since we brought that human on board, the ship has been falling apart." Valak, ever logical, tried to present rational arguments. There's no evidence he's involved. He's locked up. He has no access to the systems. Rax interrupted her, pointing to a monitor displaying James's cell. Look at him. He knows something we don't. I want answers. Guards were dispatched to transfer James to a maximum security area. But when they arrived, the cell doors wouldn't respond to their commands. Access codes failed, and Valak, watching remotely, saw that the controls were being rerouted again. This isn't possible, she said, typing frantically. Meanwhile, James turned to the cameras, his smile now more pronounced. He tilted his head slightly, as if he knew Valak was watching. Let's see how quickly they learn, he murmured to himself. Rax stormed into the control room, frustrated with the escalating situation. I want all systems rebooted, he ordered. Valak hesitated. Captain, if we reboot the systems now, we might lose access to the core entirely. But before she could finish, the ship's lights began to flicker, and a message appeared on the monitors. Control is an illusion. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the growing hum that resonated through the corridors. Rax stared at the message, his frustration giving way to something deeper, a fear he wouldn't admit out loud. Valak eventually managed to restore part of the systems, but the malfunctions continued to occur unpredictably. He's manipulating us, she whispered, almost to herself. Rax, overhearing her, replied in a grim tone, No. He's testing us. The tension on the ship was reaching its peak, and James, still in his cell, could feel the control slipping further from the Vector's grasp. He knew it was only a matter of time before they were forced to confront reality. Arrogance is always the first step toward downfall, he thought, calmly returning to his seat, as if nothing was happening. Captain Rax watched the control room monitors as the ship's malfunctions escalated. Every attempt to reverse the damage seemed to be countered by something, or someone. It's impossible for him to be doing this from inside the cell, Valak said, furiously typing to regain access to the main systems. But Rax knew better. This wasn't a coincidence. He glanced again at the monitor showing James sitting calmly, and an unsettling thought struck him. He doesn't need to leave the cell to defeat us. As the ship systems continued to fail, the crew began whispering among themselves. Rumors spread that the human was some sort of special agent or a secret weapon. He doesn't even seem to care that he's locked up, one guard remarked. That's not natural. The comment was met with silence. Fear began to seep into the crew, and Rax's authority was being questioned. He felt the need to act quickly before the situation spiraled completely out of control. Rax decided to confront James directly. He entered the cell with 2 armed guards, but was met with the same enigmatic smile. Finally, Captain. I was beginning to think you'd ignore me until the ship completely fell apart, James said, his voice calm, almost friendly. Rax crossed his arms, masking his irritation. You're not in a position to make jokes, human. I want to know what you've done to my ship. James tilted his head slightly. I've done nothing. Your ship is falling apart because of something much simpler, your arrogance. James's words annoyed Rax, but he kept his composure. You speak in riddles, but we know you're involved. How are you accessing our systems? James chuckled softly, the sound clearly meant to provoke the captain. Captain, you Vectors are excellent at building impressive machines, but you never considered that these machines could be turned against you. Arrogance is a weakness, and I'm simply exploiting it. Rax stepped forward, his face mere inches from James's. If you think that scares me, you're gravely mistaken. At that moment, a new message appeared on the ship's monitors. Stability lost. Resilience will be tested. Valak, watching from the control room, realized the systems were being redirected again. He's accessing the core, she said aloud, the desperation in her voice unmistakable. Rax stormed out of the cell, leaving James behind. Before he left, James murmured, It's starting, Captain. I hope you're ready for the test. Back in the control room, Valak found something that confirmed her suspicions. "Captain, there's a signature in the commands being sent to the Corps. They're human, but not ordinary. They're autonomous war patterns from the Special Warfare Division." Rax frowned deeply. He'd heard of that division before, a legendary unit supposedly dismantled decades ago. "That's impossible," he said, but deep down, he knew it made sense. If he really is part of that, we're dealing with something far bigger than we thought. Valak managed to regain partial access to the systems, but before she could act, a hologram appeared in the control room. It was James, projected directly from the ship's core. "Now you understand, Captain," he said, his tone almost paternal. "I'm not just a prisoner. I'm a reminder of what happens when you underestimate intelligence. And I'm here to ensure that you and your crew learn this lesson, whether you like it or not." Rax stared at the hologram, feeling his frustration transform into something deeper, a mix of respect and fear. James's hologram vanished, but the weight of his words lingered in the control room. The once confident and proud crew of the Zelon was now restless and uncertain. Captain Rax stared at the monitors flashing constant warnings. "He's testing us, yes," he murmured. "But that doesn't mean we'll surrender." He ordered the crew to regain full control of the core, but Valak hesitated. "Captain, he's not just in the core. He's everywhere. Every system is responding to him." As the crew scrambled to regain control, James calmly monitored the situation from his cell. He knew the captain was trapped in a dilemma. Every attempt to reclaim command of the ship was calculated by James and countered before completion. His autonomous drones, still linked to the Zelon's infrastructure, silently carried out his commands. He didn't need brute force to win, just intelligence. "Let's see how resilient you truly are," he thought, a smile forming on his lips. However, the tide began to shift. The Zelon's crew managed to activate an improvised countermeasure, temporarily disrupting James's access to the primary core. This interruption threw a wrench into his plans. For the first time, he had to adjust his strategy. "Interesting," he muttered, analyzing the shift. "They're learning." Despite the disruption, James knew he still held the upper hand. He had more cards to play. Rax seized the opportunity to mount an offensive. He ordered Valak to activate redundant security systems and completely isolate the core. "If we can't defeat him directly, we can cut off his connection," he said, his determination renewed. Valak complied, though not without reservations. "Captain, this will leave us vulnerable. If he retaliates, we could lose everything." Rax clenched his fists. "Then we cannot fail." Yet even as he issued orders, a nagging doubt lingered in his mind. What if James had already anticipated this? Facing a more organized resistance, James escalated his attack. He rerouted life support systems in isolated sectors, sparking panic among the crew. Alarms blared throughout the ship as officers scrambled to stabilize the systems. "This is a reminder," James's voice echoed through the ship's speakers. "No matter how strong your ship is, everything crumbles when you ignore the flaws." The crew, once brimming with confidence, was now teetering on the edge of anxiety. Every move James made seemed meticulously designed to erode their morale. In the control room, Valak uncovered a hidden message buried in the access logs. It was a digital signature left by James, accompanied by an enigmatic instruction: "Connection is vulnerability. Vulnerability is strength." She was perplexed, trying to decipher its meaning. When she shared this with Rax, he frowned. "Is this some kind of lesson?" Valak shook her head. "I think he's showing us how to defeat him." "But why?" Rax had no answers. He only knew he was dealing with something far beyond his understanding. Finally, James made his final move. He reactivated the systems he had compromised, partially restoring control of the ship to the crew. "Now you have a choice," he said, his calm but firm voice resonating through the ship. "You can continue fighting me and lose everything, or you can listen. This isn't about strength. It's about intelligence. And intelligence begins when you acknowledge your weaknesses. Rax stared at the monitors, realizing that, for the first time, James was offering a truce. But the choice was not an easy one. Accepting meant admitting they had lost. The partially restored control brought momentary relief to the crew of the Zelon, but it didn't dispel the fear and uncertainty lingering aboard the ship. Captain Rax stood in front of the main console, staring at the systems that finally seemed to respond to the crew's commands again. But he knew this wasn't a victory. James had allowed it. It was clear to him now. Why did he stop? What does he really want? Rax muttered. Beside him, Valak replied quietly, "Maybe he wants us to see something we're missing." In the cell, James sat once again, looking more relaxed than ever. He knew he had reached the breaking point. The crew was caught between fear and curiosity, and the captain was beginning to doubt his own leadership. It was the perfect moment for his next move. When the cell's communication screen activated, revealing Rax on the other side, James smiled. "Captain, you've finally decided to talk. I'm impressed. I thought it would take longer." Rax, trying to mask the tension in his voice, cut straight to the point. "You've challenged us, humiliated us, and now you're giving us partial control. What's the purpose of this? What do you want?" James tilted his head, his tone calm but firm. "I want you to learn. The universe is vast, and your species is strong. But strength without wisdom is a recipe for disaster. You've built powerful ships, but you've forgotten that even the strongest structures have flaws. And those flaws stem from arrogance." As she listened, Valak began piecing together James's cryptic messages with the events aboard the ship. "Connection is vulnerability. Vulnerability is strength," she repeated to herself. She realized James wasn't merely attacking them. He was exposing something fundamental about their systems and themselves. "Captain, what if he's not just testing us? What if he's showing us how to improve?" Rax glanced at her skeptically. "Improve? He nearly destroyed our ship. This feels more like a lesson in submission than an invitation to learn." The crew, overhearing parts of the conversation, began debating among themselves. Some believed James had a valid reason, while others wanted to eliminate him immediately. "Why are we listening to this human?" one high-ranking officer demanded. "He brought us to our knees and now wants to teach us? We don't need this." But others, particularly the younger and less entrenched members of the Vector's militaristic pride, started to question. If he was truly our enemy, why didn't he destroy us when he had the chance? The tension between the two sides grew, and Rax knew he needed to act before his crew splintered completely. Sensing the growing division, James seized the moment to press Rax further. "You're a good leader, Captain. I can see that. But you're trapped by what you've been taught, that strength is everything, that the strongest survive. That's not leadership. Leadership is knowing when to admit you don't know everything. It's listening, learning, and adapting. You have a choice now. You can treat me as an enemy and continue this cycle of destruction, or you can accept that perhaps I'm here to open your eyes." Rax felt the weight of those words. For the first time, he was being challenged in a way he couldn't resolve through force. Finally, Rax addressed the entire crew through the ship's internal communication system. "I know many of you are confused and angry. I know you've lost faith in the safety of our ship and in our leadership. But, in the face of what we're dealing with, we have to ask ourselves, are we ready to accept our weaknesses? Are we prepared to learn, even if it means listening to someone we consider inferior?" James didn't destroy us because he doesn't want to destroy. He wants to teach. And as the captain of this ship, I am willing to listen. Because if we don't learn today, we may not get another chance. Captain Rax's decision to listen to James brought a tense silence to the bridge of the Zelon. The crew, composed of officers who had always believed in strength as the ultimate solution, was visibly divided. Some saw the choice as a sign of weakness, while others recognized the need to understand something beyond their limited view of power. James, observing the collective hesitation from his cell, knew it was the right moment to solidify his point. "You've taken the first step," he said through the ship's communication system. "But that doesn't mean you'll understand everything right away." Rax opened the direct communication channel with James. "You have our attention. Explain exactly what you're trying to teach us. What do you mean by vulnerability being strength?" James leaned toward the camera, his gaze sharp and filled with intensity. "Vulnerability means accepting that you're not perfect, that you're not invincible. When you embrace that, you gain the ability to grow, adapt, and survive. You've built a powerful fleet, but you rely so heavily on brute strength that you've forgotten what it means to think strategically, to anticipate the unexpected." As James spoke, Valak monitored the ship systems, searching for a pattern behind the manipulations he had orchestrated. She noticed something she had overlooked before. James hadn't caused irreparable damage. Every malfunction, every deviation in the systems had been carefully controlled to avoid permanent harm. "He never intended to destroy us," she said aloud, catching Rax's attention. "He could have completely disabled us, but he chose not to. He's been guiding us down this path the entire time." Rax pondered Valak's words as he looked at James's hologram. "So, you brought us to our knees just to prove you could? To teach us humility?" James let out a short laugh. "I didn't bring you to your knees, Captain. You did that yourselves. All I did was expose your weaknesses. And now that you know you're not invincible, you can start to understand what truly matters. The universe is bigger than you imagine, and there are forces out there that don't care how big your ship is." The crew began to grasp the depth of what was unfolding. What had started as a fight for survival was evolving into a lesson in self-awareness. A young officer, one of Rax's harshest critics, mustered the courage to speak. "Captain, maybe he's right. We've never faced anyone like this before. Maybe it's because we've never stopped to think that power isn't everything." Rax turned to the officer, surprised by his candor, and replied, "You're right. It's not easy to admit, but maybe we've never truly understood what leadership means." James seized the moment to deepen his message. He shared fragments of his past, memories of battles he had won not through strength but with creative and unpredictable strategies. He recounted how his division had faced stronger enemies and triumphed because they knew how to recognize their own limitations and turn them into advantages. "I'm not so different from you," he said. "I was arrogant once, too, overconfident. But I learned the hard way that true strength comes from humility and adaptability." When the communication ended, Rax called his senior staff into a meeting. He appeared visibly calmer, yet more serious than ever. "We can't ignore what's happened here," he began. "James didn't just expose our weaknesses, he gave us an opportunity to learn. I don't know if we're ready to accept everything he said, but one thing is clear: our view of power needs to change. Because if we don't, someone like him, or worse, will destroy us without hesitation." Valak, typically skeptical, nodded in agreement. "Maybe this is the start of something bigger, Captain." And for the first time, the Zelon's crew found themselves not just questioning their mission, but questioning the very foundations of their beliefs. The seeds of transformation had been planted, and whether they would flourish or wither depended entirely on what they chose to do next. When James was finally transferred to the auxiliary ship that would return him to the desolate planet, the atmosphere aboard the Zelon was profoundly changed. The crew, still bearing the sting of their initial humiliation, now felt the weight of something far greater than a simple defeat. Valak watched the monitors as the auxiliary ship departed, her hands trembling slightly from everything she had witnessed. "He could have destroyed us," she murmured to herself, echoing a thought that seemed omnipresent in everyone's mind. "But he chose not to." "Why?" On the planet, James stepped out of the auxiliary ship and gazed at the barren horizon with a serene expression. He knew he had left a mark on the Zelon and its crew, but he held no illusions that his lesson would bring immediate change. Change is slow, he thought as he walked among the rocky formations. But sometimes, all it takes is planting a seed. He looked up at the sky, where the Zelon was slowly vanishing, and a faint smile crossed his lips. They'll remember. On the bridge of the Zelon, Captain Rax was deep in thought as the ship returned to Vector territory. He had re-evaluated everything: his leadership, his crew's strength, and even his species' identity as a dominant force in the universe. He knew that admitting weakness was a difficult concept for the Vectors, but he also knew that James was right. "Arrogance is the greatest enemy," he muttered. Valak, overhearing him, replied, "Maybe true strength is recognizing that before it's too late." In the days that followed, Rax convened meetings with his team to discuss the events and the lessons learned. James wasn't just a human. He began in one such meeting. He was a reflection of what we might face if we continue to believe we're invincible. We need to rethink our approach, not just on the battlefield, but in how we see ourselves in the universe. Because if we don't learn from this, someone, or something, will teach us in a far harsher way. James, back in his small shelter on the planet, reflected on his interaction with the Vectors. He knew that his life's mission, after so many years as a strategist, had shifted. Now, he was a solitary traveler, carrying lessons for those he encountered. "I'm not a hero or a savior," he thought. "I'm just someone who has seen what arrogance can do." He adjusted a small long-range transmitter, sending out a message he knew the Vectors wouldn't forget. True strength lies in intelligence, and intelligence begins with humility. Aboard the Zelon, James's message reached Captain Rax as he sat alone in the command room. He read the words and felt a mixture of emotions: shame, respect, and, above all, determination. He knew the changes necessary would be difficult and met with resistance, but he also knew his species' survival depended on them. "He's not our enemy," Rax finally admitted. "He's the warning we needed." As the ship drifted farther into the stars, Rax looked out with a new understanding. He knew the universe was vast, dangerous, and full of challenges, but he also saw it now as a place where learning was as crucial as fighting. James left us with a choice, he thought. It's up to us to decide whether we learn from it or condemn ourselves to destruction. With that, he ordered the crew to document the events, not as a humiliation, but as a turning point. The moment when the Vectors began to see the universe with new eyes, ready to embrace the lessons it had to offer, no matter how humbling they might be.